Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, producer and also an occasional host. On this episode, I'm pleased to first welcome Andrew Klavan onto the show. Andrew Klavan is an award-winning crime novelist, screenwriter, and a regular host at the Daily Wire. He joins me to talk about a new Netflix documentary released last week called Knock Down the House, detailing the rise of 29-year-old Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the November 2018 congressional primaries. Afterwards, Acton's president and co-founder, Reverend Robert Sirico, addresses religion on the left, as well as the connections between faith and freedom. All the articles referenced in this episode, as well as some additional reading materials, are linked in the show notes, which I post to Acton's blog every Wednesday when our episodes release. And you can find those at blog.acton.org. That's blog.acton.org. Also, last but not least, don't forget to swing over to acton.org/line and subscribe to this podcast.
If I was a rational person, I would have dropped out of this race a long time ago.
Crowley hasn't had a primary challenger in 14 years.
He's taken $3 million per cycle. He's going to tell me I'm small, that I'm young, that I'm inexperienced.
Joining me to talk about the new Netflix documentary, Knock Down the House, is Andrew Klavan, the award-winning crime novelist, screenwriter, and a regular host at the Daily Wire. Andrew, I am glad to have you on the show.
It's nice to be here, Carolyn. Thanks.
So this documentary was released about a week ago on May 1st, and it has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's fared well with critics, unsurprisingly, and it has also been popular with Netflix viewers. It's being called the year's most rousing political documentary, and it follows 4 far-left women running for Congress in 2018 against establishment Democrats. It's a very emotional movie, and it really tugs at the heartstrings. As a screenwriter yourself, I want to first ask you, as you were watching this movie, did you notice any tools being used to bias the viewer? Basically, what are the elements in this movie that make it so convincing?
Oh, well, they stuck to a very tried and true American story. It's really a universal story of the little guy up against Goliath, basically. It's about these 4 people who haven't got a chance. Everybody's entrenched. Their opponents are deeply entrenched people in the government, which nobody likes. Nobody ever likes the government. And they're standing up for the little guy, and you see them again and again with their impassioned causes. One of them has lost a child and is fighting for universal health care. Ocasio-Cortez, of course, is in this district that has a lot of minority people, and she's running against this kind of fat-faced white guy who's been in office in the Queen's machine, which is one of the most powerful political machines in the country. So she really is up against something of real power and of truly entrenched power. And so it's a great story in that regard. And I think that one of the things that the left has always known is that you can use these stories because they appeal to certain things that are true, but they don't necessarily have to say things that are true. The example that I always use is the example if I show you a film, say a minute-long film about a soldier returning home from the war, and he comes back and his children see him from down the road, and they run out to meet him, and his wife sees him, and she's, finally he's home, and we all tear up, and we feel this very deeply, and then the whole family goes out to McDonald's, and it's an ad. You can use classic stories, universal stories, to sell anything.
Instead of kind of using this time to almost, drag AOC through the mud, because I think it's been done a lot by conservative commentators. It's easy to do, but at the same time, I don't think that we can discredit her by calling her a socialist anymore, because unfortunately, among a lot of people in younger generations, just calling her a socialist doesn't raise the same alarms that it did for past generations. And in a way, this is kind of a case study on the ideas driving millennials towards socialism, or at least policies that they believe will help set up situations that will provide more equality. So what do you see as being the main themes or ideologies driving this documentary?
Well, it's a really interesting point, and I'm happy to drag Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
It's easy to do, and it's tempting.
Yeah. Well, she's an ignorant person. She's not a person with a lot of knowledge. She doesn't really know what works and what doesn't work, what has worked and what won't work. She has no subtlety. Even in the film, you see her getting up and making these impassioned pleas. She's very attractive. She's both physically attractive and her personality is attractive. And it tells, she stands up and you kind of, you straighten up and you watch her. And even when she's speaking, if you pay attention, she speaks in great generalities. Her programs never have a means of support. They never have a way of paying for them. Whenever she's asked, she always seems startled whenever she's asked by somebody, an interviewer, how are you going to pay for that? She always says, well, how did we pay for World War II? As if everything were the kind of crisis, kind of existential crisis that World War II is, and so she's a very, very she's very good at being in this film. There's a place for her in this film. But I was struck by something else, because I think you're right about this. I think that just attacking her, while fair, because she is ignorant and she is playing off the ignorance of others, but just attacking her is missing the point. The thing that struck me about this is the people who she appeals to and the people who Donald Trump appealed to both had the same complaint, and I think it's a complaint that we on the right should listen to. The complaint is that they're being left behind, okay? What they keep saying, what she keeps saying, and what all the people keep saying in this documentary is the government doesn't care about us. We have been left behind. The rich thrive, and we're left here with nothing. And some of them in this documentary are talking about their race. The white people have left them behind. But the people who called out to Donald Trump and who responded to Donald Trump were saying, our economies have been left behind. Our manufacturing base has gone to other countries while people sit in the cities and invest in weird, mechanisms that we don't even understand. We can't feed our families anymore. And I thought, that is a cry that we would be unwise not to pay attention to. It's interesting to me that both the left and the right are working off a contradiction. The contradiction in this movie that kept coming up to me, kept kind of leaping out at me, is these people are complaining that the government doesn't care about us, the government isn't there for us, it's there for itself, it serves the entrenched powers. And so what we want is more government. And you think, well, that's a contradiction. That's silly. What you should want is less government. What you should want is the freedom to do for yourself. I mean, that is obviously the answer. The answer is, here's this tremendous mechanism that only cares about itself and only cares about entrenched power. Let's make it even bigger, which is what essentially Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the others are talking about. They should stop and think, no, that's not a good idea. But on the right, there's also a paradox as well, a contradiction as well, which is this. We believe in the mediating institutions. We believe in the church. We believe in the Elks Club. We believe in the family. We believe in all these institutions, the community, that support people without the government having to. Because whenever the government gives you something, it also takes away your freedom. Whatever it gives you, it takes a corresponding amount of your freedom away. But the problem is that capitalism is such a successful enterprise. Capitalism is such a successful system that it sometimes goes so fast that it leaves people behind, right? I mean, it mechanizes their institutions, their occupations. It creates self-driving trucks. It creates machines that do their jobs. And people get left behind and communities get decimated. And a lot of times you hear right-wing conservatives and capitalists say, well, if your community has been decimated, pack up your bags, leave, and go to another community. Learn to code, learn a new trade. But that's a kind of contradiction with the idea of mediating institutions. You can't build those institutions overnight. You can't build churches overnight. You can't build communities and cities and towns overnight. So I think that in both these cases, what we have to be listening to is we have to be listening to the voice of people who are running as fast as they can but cannot keep up with modernity. And I think that we need a 21st century solution to this. The solution of the left is 19th century. It's socialism, which we have seen fail again and again. And it fails because it's a primitive system of moving money around. You have money, he doesn't, I'll take your money and I'll give it to him. It's not just immoral, it's also stupid because you got your money through enterprise and creativity, and giving it to somebody else isn't going to give that person creativity and enterprise.
Part of this is we can't create heaven on earth. There's no perfect economic system. And although we can certainly try to deregulate, and it works. Actually, just recently we've seen in the April job report that the unemployment rate is the lowest it's been for the past 50 years, currently at 3.6%. That does work, but it's still not going to create a heaven on earth, and we can't promise perfection here. It can't exist, and it won't. They say if only we allocated money in different places, that if only we directed our resources towards a class that is, supposedly, as AOC says, scrounging for leftovers from the 1%. I mean, in a way, it's basically promising a redemption or a sort of religion. These are solutions that are promising to solve everything, and that's really the danger of big government, though.
Well, first of all, I think that you have to have real religion. There's just no question about this. We're not going to take care of each other without understanding that is what God wants us to do. I mean, this is a problem. The people who are opposed to capitalism, I'm very pro-capitalism, but the people who are opposed to capitalism are opposed to the fact that people get very far ahead and they don't turn back and say, how can I help the person behind me? Except to say, let's give him money so he goes away. Let's give him a guaranteed income so he won't bother me about my success. Let's give him a program. So they don't say, how do I give him dignity? How do I give him purpose? How do I give him meaning in his life? So we need capitalism governed by religion, governed by the ideas of charity and love that are essential part of our founding religion of Christianity. We just need that. But also we need to start to think in terms of how do you essentially Christianize capitalism itself? How do you make a capitalism that says, okay, our new technology has destroyed your occupation. How are we going to get you into the next occupation that you can do so that you can continue to have a purpose, continue to have a meaning, continue to go home to your kids and say, this is what I do. This is what I do in life and in the world, and this is how I make myself useful aside from raising you and building a home. So I think that's something that is not that hard to do. We just need to stop thinking in simplistic terms. And one of the things that so offended me about this movie, this Ocasio-Cortez movie, is the simplistic terms that everybody talked about. My child died. If only we had health insurance for all, that would not have happened. You have been forgotten. If only we got rid of ICE, then everything would be fine. These kind of simplistic, stupid ideas, instead of ideas like, well, how do we come into a community where the factory has left and reconstruct it so that people don't have to pack their bags on top of a truck like an Okie and try and start again somewhere else? How do we keep our communities alive in the midst of this turmoil, this creative destruction of capitalism? Those are questions that I think can be answered. I think they have to be answered.
When we're talking about this, there's a lot of ideas here that need to be connected. Where does someone start? I mean, what can they read? Where can they go for resources to learn more about connecting these ideas that you're talking about?
Well, I think, you should start with some of the classic books like The Road to Serfdom, and even if you don't read the classics themselves, you can read about them by people in articles that people have written about them, about why, starting to read about why capitalism works so well. Capitalism has cut poverty in half worldwide in an enormously short period of time. You will probably live to see worldwide poverty absolutely eradicated by free market capitalism and by property rights. But also, I think it's important to start to look at where the problems are. I think that in op-eds, one of my favorite sites is Real Clear Politics. I go on, and there are op-eds from the left and right where people bring their expertise to say, here's a problem. Here's something that's gone wrong. Here's the fact that productivity, for instance, among the top 1% has sprung forward because they have all that technology at their disposal, where among the bottom tiers of society, productivity hasn't sprung forward. Here's how we can help that. Here's how we can change it. I think you have to read, and I think you have to listen to people who are not looking for something from you. All these politicians want your vote. That's part of the system. But that means that they're going to sell you stuff that you want. You need people who are going to wrong foot you, who are going to say, I know you think A, but maybe you should consider B. And you find that in open debate. And one of the biggest problems we have in our society is an antipathy to open debate. People are being banned from Facebook. People are being banned from Twitter. People are being banned from college universities for having ideas that other people don't like. And, of course, I'm not talking about hateful, bigoted ideas, which I'm not afraid of. I'm happy to have those people speak, but I just think they're stupid and they're not helpful. I want to hear ideas about how to keep people free. Every idea you hear has a price in freedom. They say, oh, we'll give you universal health care. You think, well, wait, does that mean that if I want to smoke, I can't smoke? Does that mean if I want to go to this doctor instead of that doctor, I can't? What does that mean? Every time somebody offers you something, you should be asking, what is the price in freedom? Because freedom is the one thing that makes life worthwhile. I think freedom comes before everything else because you can't love unless you're free to love. You can't worship unless you're free to worship. You can't choose your faith unless you're free to choose your faith. So I think freedom is where our dignity comes from. I think that when people talk about religion, they frequently say, why does a good God allow evil? The answer is because he puts freedom first. He knows that our freedom to love him, our freedom to choose him, our freedom to choose to do good is what makes us human. And everything that the left proposes takes that freedom away. And frequently the right proposes freedom without considering the cost in humanity. And I think that those are just things that we all have to be thinking about.
So I want to go back to some points that you were making about the women, their stories being represented in this film. I think it's easy a lot of the times to get caught up in these stories and think they are way more moral than the people currently in Congress. They have real life experiences and they understand me and they can provide the security that I need. But really, no one is exempt from human tendency towards power, and even them. And I think one of the core bedrock kind of, you could say, principles of conservatism is that no one is exempt from gaining power, wanting more power, and using it to your own advantage. It's just human nature.
Right. Well, I think you're right. And, you've made two universal, eternally true points. One is that life is tragic and it can never be made perfect. And whenever anybody is offering you that, they're lying and they're selling you something. And the other is, of course, that power corrupts and ultimate power corrupts, absolutely. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you always want to be looking for ways to neutralize power centers. And this is an important thing because everybody forgets this. When the power center is something they like. Even businesses can get too powerful. Even corporations can get too powerful and have to be curtailed. That's why no system, including capitalism, can be left completely unregulated. We always want to look at where power coalesces, because wherever it coalesces, corruption coalesces with it, and abuse coalesces with it. And that's why, you ask why that movie is so powerful. It's because, in fact, these candidates are weaker people taking on more powerful people, and that is always a good system. I mean, in Paradise Lost, even Satan becomes the poem Paradise Lost, even Satan becomes an interesting character because he's taking on an all-powerful God. Whenever weaker people take on stronger people, they take on an aspect of the heroic. Everybody has always noticed this. And there's a reason for that, because unless you're talking about God, who's absolutely good, power corrupts, and it corrupts human beings, and it corrupts everybody. And so I think that that's just something, our founders thought about every single day. Every word of the Federalist Papers, which everybody should read, is trying to figure out what to do to keep the power from coalescing. And it's so fascinating to me to see that university students are never schooled in this. Nobody talks about it. Nobody says, hey, wait, that's giving the government too much power. That's giving this corporation too much power. Nobody thinks that that power is always a problem, and it always is.
Would you say that this movie is propaganda?
No question about it. Yeah, because the reason it's propaganda is because it doesn't engage in any of the ideas that are being run on. What do people run on? They run on policy and ideas. It never explores the idea of what would happen if you eliminated ICE. It never explores the idea of how much it would cost to have universal health care. I could say, I'll give you universal health care. I could say, I'll give you universal health. What difference does it make what I say if you don't explore how that idea would work, what it would cost, what it's done to other countries, what it means that, to be free to have your own health care, all those things. It never examines any of that. It simply poses an emotional situation, which is what stories do. It poses the emotional situation that this candidate is powerful and strong and in power, and this woman is coming from beneath to try and beat him. That's an emotional situation. We root for her. That's propaganda because, as I say, you could sell a McDonald's hamburger with that story, or you could sell the truth with that story. And this one basically sells the McDonald's hamburger of socialism. Not to knock McDonald's. I think McDonald's works a lot better than socialism, but you know what I mean.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming onto the show with me today. It was a pleasure to speak with you about this.
It's nice to talk to you. Thanks very much.
Every year in June, Acton University brings together nearly 1,000 people in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to explore the foundations of a free society. And this year, we're excited to be opening registration for each evening's dinner and plenary session for those who can't attend the full conference. Join us on the evening of June 18 to hear Marianne Kalam speak firsthand about her witness of Soviet-occupied Estonia and her work to champion freedom after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Save your spot at this event before seats fill up and register at acton.org/events.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today my guest is Father Robert Sirico, co-founder and president of the Acton Institute. Father Robert and I will be discussing the religious left, in particular the religious attitudes and commitments of prominent politicians and intellectuals on the left, as well as the proper relationship between politics and the Christian faith. Father Robert, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Always a delight. Thank you.
Recently, the New York Times has kind of been a catalyst for this. Timothy Egan has recently written about some high-profile figures in Democratic Party politics who identify with the Christian left. He wrote an editorial entitled How to Break the Republican Lock on God. Egan highlights in particular the presidential candidates, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Senator Cory Booker, as well as former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. He says, quote, like Abrams and Senator Cory Booker, Mayor Pete says his faith made him a progressive. Scripture directs him to defend the poor, the sick, the marginalized, the social cast-offs, end quote. Should a commitment to the care of the poor, the sick, and the marginalized lead one to embrace modern progressivism, or indeed any political platform or ideology?
Well, this is a fundamental category mistake that they're making. It's a rather simple mistake, and it is that when we are called to defend the poor, which is manifestly obvious and repeated and a constitutive part of what the Christian revelation is about, they very often want to make it translate immediately into a political agenda or a political platform of some sort. And I think that's basically the mistake. The fact that the early Christians shared their wealth, went and sold their property and placed it at the apostles' feet is an example of Christians being inspired to surrender their property to other people. This is a very different thing than a political platform which redistributes other people's property, which confiscates people's property, and uses it for maybe good intentions, maybe not good intentions, maybe well thought out programs, maybe not so well thought out programs. So it's a category mistake that needs to be distinguished, that has historically been distinguished in Christian theology, and to the extent that the church has probed this question of the relationship between God and Caesar. And it is a complete politicization of the gospel message.
Well said. The Christian left and many Christians on the right, as well as the center in American political life, have been critical of President Trump's personal behavior and rhetoric. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, in particular, has been even critical of Mike Pence's religious faith for his stance on same-sex marriage. What role should the speech and life of politicians play in a Christian's evaluation of both as both politicians and as sort of tied to their ideological commitments?
Well, again, I don't want to be too repetitive, but someone once said that the mark of the mature mind is the ability to make distinctions. So let's make a set of distinctions here. The first is, and I have great sympathy, and I'm on record, I don't care for the president's rhetoric. I don't like his behavior, his attitude. I may have said this before here, but I've said it in other forums, that I know that accent very well. I mean, it's a very New York dismissive, sometimes very funny, sometimes very witty, sometimes very insightful, attitude. But it is beneath, I think, both public discourse, general civil discourse, certainly beneath Christian discourse. I mean, we do it. At times we do it. Hopefully we go to confession when we do it. but there's no justification for it. So I get that. I agree with that. That is different, very different, from the accusation that Mayor Buttigieg, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, has made against Vice President Pence. To my knowledge, Vice President Pence has never said anything despairing on a personal level, dismissive or vulgar or in any way coarse about homosexually oriented people. What he's simply done has been to articulate the, in the case of Christianity, 2,000-year tradition of the church, or in the case of Judaism, even further back than that, with regard to actions that are deemed immoral. To simply say that the articulation of that traditional understanding of human sexuality is itself hate speech, it shows the man is either being politically manipulative or is theologically shallow. The distinction between the sinner and the sin is precisely what we see in the gospel, where Jesus encounters the woman who is caught in the act of adultery, loves her, protects her, defends her dignity, says he does not condemn her, and then says, now sin no more. And if we can't say that as a civil society and certainly as a religiously informed society, which the mayor claims in his own faith profession, then we can't make any moral statements about anything, because to say that something is moral is to say that the opposite of it is immoral. And if we can't make those moral distinctions and those moral judgments, then I think we can't speak in a moral vocabulary.
No, it reminds me of the Apostle John. I write to you that you may not sin.
Right.
But if you
have sinned.
If you have sinned.
Right.
Yeah.
This is not a question of the person identifying the sin on the part of another person, saying that they themselves are without sin. When I say in the confessional, ego te absolvo, that doesn't mean, oh, and by the way, I'm not in need of absolution, because I go to confession too.
Does the Christian faith have political content? Well, what's the relation between the Christian faith and political ideology? The Christian faith and individual policy issues.
Now you see, you are asking the right questions. The questions you are identifying here are very important. So let's go through them. What does the Christian faith, or does the Christian faith have political content? Mm-hmm. As such, no, because the Christian faith is not a political system. It is not a theocratic arrangement. When Jesus was asked a kind of policy question, he says, no, wait a minute. There's God and there's Caesar. The policy question he was being asked had to do with taxation. Is it lawful to pay the tax? And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God. So then you have to ask the question, what is Caesar's and what is God's? And the role of Caesar is to govern and maintain justice, to govern, to prevent people from acts of coercion and the like. God requires our full devotion. In this sense, it's totalist. The government is not totalist. It's not a totalitarian government. So the mistakes occur on both sides of the political spectrum, the left and the right, because there is this tendency toward a theocratic impulse. Or, to put it in a more secular rendering, we want to say that what our policies are, the society we construct, is moral, and it should be. But our first and primary and normative expression of morality is not through legislation. It's not through the state. It's through a culture. It's through a set of beliefs. It's through a consensus or an agreed-upon philosophy of morality. And I think this is the mistake that people are making in the modern discourse, that that the Christian faith has to have political content, as though there was a verse or two or three in the Bible that tells us about the proper levels of taxation or their disposition. And then the relation of the Christian faith to political ideology should be simply that the Christian faith transcends any specific temporal political order because the church transcends history. So what she says in the book of Acts and what she says today should be consistent because it comes from revelation. It comes from a set of principles. And the political currents come and go depending on the geography, depending on the economy, depending on the rulers, depending on the effectiveness of democracy, or 1,000 other contingent points. So the role of the Christian faith ought to inspire certain principles that can be adapted prudentially to given contingent circumstances of particular people. Where the confusion comes in very often is that, especially when a state exceeds its proper function as maintaining order, running the judiciary, providing for the common good and the protection of borders and things like that, these generally agreed upon roles of what the state should be in their limited capacity. When it exceeds that, for instance, in areas of property, can the church build a facility on this, or can the church organize certain charitable functions guided by her moral teaching, and the state says, no, you have to have our permission to love the poor, to clothe the hungry, to take care of orphans, and you must do it according to these laws. And these laws, these civil laws contradict the law of God. The church will resist that, will rebel against it, or to use St. Peter's words, we would rather obey God than man. Then it seems that the church is being political, but it's really not the church being political. The church is being the church, and politics has become religious in effect.
And we spoke earlier on an episode of Acton Line about Father Ernesto Cardinal and the Catholic Church's prohibition on clergy holding public office. Where do you think the line between religious leadership and political activism lies? And that's something that, with these sort of distinctions we're trying to make, that clergy have to be particularly aware and mindful of.
I think one of the greatest examples of religious impulse and religious leadership, or two great examples, and they really one is an outgrowth of the other, would be in the movement of abolition. And that was this religious tenet that said that human beings have a certain intrinsic dignity, that they should not be the chattel or the property of other people, and a growing movement to express that moral sentiment, that moral belief, grew and weakened the institutions of slavery. And then, of course, one of the outgrowths of that was the early work of Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was first and foremost a minister of the gospel. And when you read or listen to his sermons or his early writings, particularly his highly sophisticated letter from Birmingham jail, you see a moral leadership. Now, that moral leadership can have a political effect, but King was never a politician. And I think the greatest religious leaders can have the greatest cultural impact, which can, in turn, have a great civil and political impact as well. But I think to confuse the two is very dangerous, because then you have what especially progressives fear most and have accused Christians of very often, and rightly so in some cases, of being theocrats. And I think theocracy is wrong, not only because it hurts the society in which it exists, but because it hurts the witness of the gospel. It reduces the witness of the gospel to a contingent, prudential, and political policy rather than the transcendent revelation of God in the person of Christ to the world.
To close, I'd like to bring up a recent piece by David Bentley Hart, who's an affiliate scholar of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study and a contributing writer to First Things. The piece was entitled, quote, "Can we please relax about socialism?" unquote. Joe Carter had a nice response to his argument on the Acton Power blog. The piece is really mean-spirited. It impugns the honesty, intelligence, motives, and even the physical appearance of people who disagree with him. Referring to the piece, the economist Tyler Cowen asked the question, quote, "Whatever you think of the socialism discussion, should Christians have and indeed display so much contempt for other human beings?" unquote. When we disagree with others about these political prudential questions, what's our duty towards them?
The thing I want to focus on, I think Hart has become a caricature of himself. He may want to argue against free markets and capitalism and all that, and that's certainly a legitimate argument to have. But to do it in the manner in which he does in the New York Times and in these other pieces, and I'm not sure he's still writing for First Things, at least I think they've probably cut down on him. The thing I want to focus on here is how sad it is that the New York Times is publishing an article with such rhetoric, with such ad hominem attacks that substitute. I mean, I read that article and I was 3 or 4 paragraphs into it before I got to the argument he was trying. So the argument is very thin. There's something strange going on at the New York Times. Of course, a lot of people on our side of these questions are going to say that's been a long time coming. But I have always had a great respect for the New York Times, even though I disagree with them. I've told people I listen to NPR every morning, because I like the tone of the news and everything. And I do it for penance. But the bias of these agencies, NPR and now the New York Times, is coming to the fore. And what is very strange about the New York Times, both in the publication of the Hart piece, but also this very alarming anti-Semitic cartoon that appeared recently.
Yeah,
and then another one, another similar kind of thing. Something strange is happening at the New York Times. I don't know if they've just gone nuts because of Trump or if just the whole standard has dropped. But it's very sad to see the gray old lady toothless.
No, well, thank you so much for being with us, Father Robert. And you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and always enjoy speaking with you.
Always great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. If you have any feedback about this podcast, I would love to hear it. Every week, our podcast team is working to bring you the best show, and we couldn't do it without you. Let me know what you think about this podcast and email me at actonline@acton.org. This episode is produced and edited by me, Caroline Roberts, with audio mixing by Doug Nagel.